system things to talk about, and then thought we'd talk about climate change and aquatic ecosystems. Fresh water.
Climate change doesn't exist.
Anyway, so ecosystem ecology is about nutrient cycling and energy flow, and so spent a bunch of time on nutrient cycling, and we talked a little bit about energy flow with trophic webs and trophic cascades, and wanted to spend a tiny bit of time talking about nutrient budgets and energy budgets that ecologists sometimes put together. And so we think about food webs and stuff eating other stuff, but we try to include how much energy or maybe even how many nutrients are moving from one place to another. And so we can figure this out if we, instead of just like naming the species involved, we also try to measure biomass involved. So it wouldn't just be like we've got, this species of diatom, but we might try to figure out how much biomass of that diatom that we have. And so that's one potential factor, but to really get into the nitty gritty of energy flow or nutrient cycling and all of the energy moving or elements moving, some crazy people like to calculate production or productivity. And so this is the flux or the movement of carbon or energy or some other element through an ecosystem compartment, so through, from primary producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers. So that's sort of flow. And completely not really related to this, these two pictures are from Acadia National Park in Maine, which is a lovely park. It's very small, but it's quite nice. Anyway, so let's talk more about production. Okay, so we can talk about primary production, which is all about the photosynthesizers and how much carbon they are sucking in and converting into plant material. And there's also something called secondary production, and this is where we look at all of the consumers. So this would be herbivores and detritivores and predators. We have all of them involved. And so secondary production, it's something, it's highly variable in any particular species. And secondary production is going to, like how fast that's happening will depend on how much biomass you've got in the first place, and then also how fast your growth rates are. And so, what does temperature do to growth rates?
Increases.
So what has to increase or what changes with temperature to increase production? Like, higher temperature, yeah. So if it gets warmer, growth rates will probably be higher. If it's colder, growth rates probably lower. Growth rates might also be variable due to like how much food is around, that kind of thing. All right, and secondary production, it's kind of a pain in the butt to measure, but measuring only biomass, which is easier to measure, it's not a very good proxy for production because there's so much variability with growth rates. So even if you had like a lot of biomass, if they're growing really slowly, their production could be low even though there's a lot of them. On the other hand, if you had a small amount of biomass, they might be growing really quickly, they might be getting eaten really fast, and so you just don't see the biomass even if they're making it really fast. So biomass and production don't necessarily match up. And you can measure secondary production for macroinvertebrates, which is pretty commonly done. The lab that Grubach came out of at Georgia, they would measure a lot of secondary production of macroinvertebrates from streams. I don't remember if he had to do that or not, but I'm guessing he did. You can measure it for fish. You can also measure it for amphibians. We've seen it a lot with inverts. And why might you care about this? You could use this as one example. You could assess food availability for game fish or waterfowl. So if you were interested in management questions about certain species of birds or fish, knowing something about like how their food sources are doing, how fast they're growing, how much is available. If they're growing quickly, that tells you how much could be available in the future. That sort of thing. Alright, all that makes sense? Okay. And just some graphs. So this is biomass with a bunch of our trophic levels, production, and then the ratio of production compared to biomass. So if we just measure biomass in any particular ecosystem, this is from a spring in Florida, and if you just measure total biomass, you have a lot of biomass of primary producers, and then everything else is smaller. If you measure production, still have a lot of producers, so there's still a lot of that, but then you start to see much more activity, especially in decomposers, also herbivores, still not a huge amount with the carnivores on top. And then taking the ratio of production to biomass, and so basically for any given unit of mass for some type of organism, how productive are they, like pound per pound, how productive is this organism? And so decomposers are really pretty wildly active, and they're growing really fast, and compared to their biomass, they grow really fast. Even though there's a lot of producers, they're kind of slow, and so we don't see this huge like pound for pound deal. So anyway, main point, biomass and production can be quite different. Okay, where are we going next? Thinking about, so production is still about energy, it could also be about carbon, but a little bit more about energy flow through the trophic levels, through the food web. It's not 100% efficient to go from one trophic level to the next. So if you eat so if a fish eats a pound of macroinvertebrates, they don't gain a pound of fish. They don't make a whole pound of fish. Some of that's gonna get burned off just in cellular maintenance. Some of it's going to get pooped out, some of it's not digestible. So there's not 100% efficiency of energy transfer from one trophic level to the next. And there can be quite a range of efficiency. So herbivorous insects. So I'm assuming this is the food that they eat. It's been a long time since I made this slide. I'm assuming the food that they eat, they've got a 30 to 60% efficiency of transfer, of energy transfer from their food into their tissues. Carnivores, even a wider range, 15 to 77% efficiency. And so usually if you're eating more like meaty stuff, or like more of the good stuff, you'll have a better efficiency. So that's just something to consider, and I think you heard about that in general ecology and 130 back in the day. All right, and then finally, super crazy people like to calculate nutrient budgets. And so Grubach talked about all these nutrient cycles and just the different transformations and how nitrogen can change as it goes through the cycle, that kind of thing. So nutrient budgets, people actually do the math on how much of the nitrogen atoms are in ammonium versus nitrate and how much denitrification is happening and how much nitrification is happening. Like, they want to know the actual numbers. And so these people are really crazy. And they have to do a lot of math, and they do a lot of computer stuff, and they make figures like this, where, so this is looking at nitrogen fluxes in this system where you've got caddisflies and sediment and snails and nostocs of cyanobacterium, and just, they actually measured and did the math for how much nitrogen was moving from where to where. So just one little figure probably took like 5 years to do all that work. So, but it can tell you some cool things about how nitrogen moves in an ecosystem. So that was a very quick look at energy flow. Questions, comments, concerns? Alright, let's talk about climate change, yay! We're already also perky. Let's talk about something that'll make us feel more perky. Okay. Welcome to the Anthropocene era. You heard this term, Anthropocene era. When you talk about the geological eras, like Jurassic period or whatever, and those are all divided up based on like evolutionarily interesting happenings from various times. And so we're now in the Anthropocene era, where humans are having a big impact on all other species. So we've been calling current times the Anthropocene. Alright, anyway, familiar with that graph? Have you seen that one before? This is the measurement of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere at Mauna Loa, which is in Hawaii. And so this is a good place to measure CO2 concentration in the atmosphere because it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and there's not a lot of influence from like cities or exhaust or factories or anything. So it's a pretty good measure of just like on average how much CO2 is in the Earth's atmosphere. And they've been measuring this for over 60 years, and we have seen this increase in CO2 from 1960. And the crazy thing with CO2 is it's only like right now 0.04% of the atmosphere. It's such a small fraction of the atmosphere, but it's really important. It used to be at about 0.03%, and now we have more. And this is from burning of fossil fuels. So that's what all of the evidence tells us. And so why do we care about CO2 in the atmosphere with climate change?
CO2 raises the atmospheric temperature?
Yeah, CO2 is like they call it a greenhouse gas, and it helps hold heat on the Earth. So like when in the summertime when your car gets really hot, sunlight goes right through the windows. It's very high energy, and it heats up all the stuff in your car, which radiates heat back, and that heat is lower energy, and it can't really escape the windows, so it gets trapped in your car. That's the greenhouse effect. You open your car door, it's 1,000 degrees in there. And so CO2 does the same thing. It helps hold heat in the atmosphere, and if we did not have any greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, based on our distance from the sun, we would be frozen solid. So if we didn't have it, we'd be boots gray, which is pig Latin for screwed. So there's that. And this is just a graph to show you that our current levels of CO2 in the atmosphere are higher than we've seen in a really long time. They've taken measurements from ice cores, and they figure out the age of the ice core, and then atmospheric gases trapped in the ice, they can measure CO2 concentrations. And so it's been about 3 million years or more, 5 million years, since CO2 levels have been higher than they are now. So we have raised them quite a bit. And this is average global temperature since 1880. So CO2 in the line, and then blue means it's below average, red is above average. So we've been kind of increasing over the last 130 years or so. That's on that graph. And then this figure is just showing, like based on, looking at change in temperature, and somehow they did some math figuring out the drivers that are involved with that. And so the black line is the observed temperature. The red is supposed to show the human, like, drivers of that temperature increase, which kind of tracks with the overall increase. Any natural changes that might affect global temperature, this is in blue, and so it's kind of, there are natural changes to CO2, but it doesn't explain the increase that we've seen in total. So there is that. And then this graph showing a study that was looking at some possible scenarios for warming in the future, and based on how much we want to do to control greenhouse gases, we can have a small increase in temperature, or we can have a very large increase in temperature. So there is a lot of science to back all of this up. So even though there's like political drama about is climate change real and are we the cause, the science is pretty clear about it. Okay. Any questions? So that last graph, we've got these quote projections, and just to comment about projections is that we've never seen this happen before, so it really is kind of difficult to know ultimately what's going to happen. And we can build lots of computer models, and based on what we've seen happen already, what do we think will happen in the future? And maybe that'll happen, and maybe it won't. So it's kind of hard to say. But we do have some like overall predictions that have been made, and I'm just going to focus on things that will affect inland aquatic ecosystems. So some overall predictions. So I apologize for the boring textiness of these slides, but I posted it so you don't have to write it all down. So we do expect negative effects on both the quantity and the quality of freshwater resources. We expect warming temperatures, which we're seeing. And then also changes in regional precipitation patterns. So some places might be a lot drier than they were in the past. Some places might be a lot wetter than they were in the past.
Like snow over in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, like snow in Saudi Arabia. We'll have higher variability in precipitation. So it could be wetter storms, storms with like a lot more rain than we typically see in one storm, or it doesn't rain for 3 months and then it rains every day for a month. So we could have some changes in variability in precipitation.
Like the back-to-back hurricanes that we had for 3 weekends.
Yeah, like all the hurricanes that we were having. And then increasing frequency, magnitude, and unpredictability of flooding and droughts. And so I always think of the Waverly floods now, because that was such a bizarre and local, just got a bunch of rain and there was like just catastrophic flooding in this town, and then areas around it were fine. And so it's just really, really crazy stuff. And Grubauer talked about impervious surfaces, right, and urban impacts of like water flow, and so also like not just climate change, but our habitat change also is going to affect flooding as well. So precipitation is going to change. Other quantity issues. So with warmer temperatures, we might have less snow in the mountains, and snowpack is really important for streams that drain mountains, because that, rain, when that happens, it's a short time frame and it goes through the stream channel relatively quickly. When you've got a snowpack in the mountain regions, it melts slowly in the spring and summer, and then that slowly feeds those streams and rivers that are draining the mountains. And so even if you have the same amount of precipitation, if it's more rain and less snow, that's going to change like the seasonal flows of streams. And we're already seeing shrinking of snowpack in mountain areas, and this will reduce stream flows. Also, if we have kind of spring coming earlier, which I feel like we've been seeing that here. Every year there's a hummingbird migration map where people report seeing their first hummingbird from the Gulf Coast up through eastern North America, and I feel like it used to be March before we saw hummingbirds, and now it's like February when we see hummingbirds. Also when the daffodils bloom, I feel like it's gotten earlier since I moved here. Anyway, but snowpack melting earlier, that will change just like the seasonal nature of downstream areas. And organisms that are have adapted to flooding at certain times of year, if it's now earlier, then that can kind of mess with how they reproduce or do whatever they do. It could affect migrating birds, all kinds of effects that can happen. And then we may also see water reduced in streams and rivers or lakes just from more evaporation. So if it's warmer, we can get more evaporation, and also just human use in general. So we've got quantity issues. So now we're getting into like quality issues. So we mentioned a few pollutants a couple lectures ago. And so if you think of all the climate change and the quantity issues with water, and then you add in the effects of pollution and other stressors like nutrient pollution, so eutrophication and exotic species and climate change, and so that's a lot of stress getting dumped on our ecosystems. And thinking about smaller bodies of water compared to larger bodies of water, the smaller a stream or a lake or a pond is, the more quickly it would be affected by warming. So like large bodies of water, it takes a lot of energy to change temperature. Smaller bodies of water takes less energy, so we'll see temperature changing in those areas first. And smaller aquatic ecosystems are also more influenced by local precipitation amounts. So if we go look at Cane Creek right now, it's probably much higher than it was this morning because of the rain that we've gotten today. I checked before I came over here that we've gotten 1.25 inches at my house already, so had a lot of rain today. So I bet Cane Creek is like up a couple of feet from that. And so smaller streams, they get influenced pretty quickly from changes in local precipitation. And warming temps, if we've got warmer temperatures, that's gonna increase evaporation. We could just have overall less water in lakes and streams, wetlands. And so just reduce water levels, and also that can concentrate pollutants, because those don't evaporate with the water, they just get more concentrated. And this might also make it more expensive for sewage treatment and water treatment. It's just such a fun lecture, it's so happy, so hopeful and joyous. Warmer and more nutrients means more algae, the kind we don't want, and more harmful algal blooms. Cyanobacteria, they like more nutrients, they also like it warmer, so we're gonna see more and more of those. But just in general, it's also difficult to predict the exact response of different freshwater habitats. In general, like this is an interesting thought. So in colder, low nutrient lakes, if it gets warmer and you add some nutrients to it, it might, initially increase species diversity in that lake because it's, warmer and there's more food. But eventually, probably wouldn't look so great, but warmer eutrophic lakes, if you get them even warmer, even more nutrients are gonna have even more problems. So, colder, lower nutrient lakes may kind of look better with warming, but already warm places, not so much. So some interesting things about higher latitudes. Do you know about permafrost? So, permafrost is areas of soil that are supposed to be permanently frozen, or they've been frozen for a really, really, really long time. And you go up to Alaska, and even in the summer, only a certain depth of the soil is gonna thaw, and then you'll have ice below that. But now that we are warmer, we are seeing some of that permafrost melting. And when it was frozen, like everything in there was locked up. But as permafrost melts, that kind of brings that soil that's melted into the active part of the ecosystem, and any phosphorus that was stored up in that ice gets liberated, and that can be introduced into freshwater ecosystems in higher latitude areas. That was the end of that sentence. And there's also like methane that gets liberated from permafrost, and methane's another greenhouse gas that holds in heat. Cow farts also make methane. So, anyway, methane is colorless and odorless, but it still comes out of cow farts. All right. Other changes, so higher latitudes that have get ice in the winter on lakes, you may have longer ice-free seasons, and that can just impact the seasonality of the lake, just in ways we just don't even know. We could get longer periods of summer stratification, so remember, in the summer, the top layers of the lake start to warm up and they're lighter, and so they rest on top of the colder layers, and you get those layers that they just kind of hang out through the summer. And higher latitudes, if the summer lasts longer, that stratification can last longer, and that increases the potential of that bottom layer, the hypolimnion, going anoxic. Anoxic, no oxygen, no bueno. No oxygen, no bueno. So, higher latitudes probably get more of an impact of temperature change. What else we got here? Species diversity. So, temperature has a big influence on lots of things for aquatic organisms, like growth rate and how big adults can get, and fecundity, or how much reproduction they do, how many offspring they have. So temperature has the ability to affect lots of things in organisms. And so even if it doesn't get like so hot that they die, there may be some sublethal effects that have an overall large effect on the reproduction. And as an example, this is a great word, desynchronization of life cycles between consumers and their resources. So if, let's say there's an organism that likes to eat algae, and it wakes up from its winter hibernation when the water temperature reaches a certain level. And in its evolutionary history, whenever it woke up, it was late enough in the spring that there was enough light reaching the stream that there were a lot of algae there for it to eat. Well, let's say that that organism wakes up a lot earlier because now it's warmer. And the thing with climate change is even if temperatures change, the amount of sunlight isn't going to change. The amount of sunlight is going to stay constant because it's about how we're tilted toward the sun and all of that. So if it's still too early in the spring, you're not getting enough light to the stream, therefore algae aren't really growing. You could have these algae eaters waking up before the algae have grown, and they're going to be in trouble because they're waking up and there's not food for them. And so that's what we mean by like a desynchronization of life cycles between consumers and their resources. I talk about climate change in my intro biology and like thinking of terrestrial organisms. It's like, well, why doesn't everything just like shift north? And it's like, well, some things can move north, but not all species are going to be able to move the same amount in the same way. And how each species changes is going to probably be different. So it's not just going to be a simple like shift to the north for everything. All right, a little bit about some wetlands. Grubauer talked about peatlands a while ago. So peat storing wetlands. Peat is partially decomposed plant material, and these are most abundant in northern areas like Canada, Scandinavia, Russia. And they are normally carbon sinks, so photosynthesis happens, they suck in carbon, and then the plant stuff that they make doesn't really decompose very much, so all that carbon gets kind of stored up. But if you've got increasing temperatures, now these peatlands could be releasing carbon. You warm them up more, you could get more decomposition, and then that's going to liberate the carbon that had been stored in the plant material. So you can be releasing more CO2 with decomposition. And look at this. Like I mentioned, methane, CH4, gets released with permafrost melting, but also with wetlands decomposing, and it's a much stronger greenhouse gas than CO2, so it holds 20 times more heat in the atmosphere, like molecule for molecule compared to CO2.
So just as a hypothetical, because these peatlands take in so much carbon, could you create more peatlands around to suck in that extra carbon that's causing the climate change? Or would that just be counterintuitive?
Yeah, I don't know how that would happen.
Just
Yeah,
as a hypothetical.
And like I think about like wetland mitigation and how we've done a lot of work to destroy wetlands, and so now we're trying to repair them or put them places where they weren't before. And so I don't know how feasible that would be. And then the whole thing, if it's warming up, then they're releasing carbon.
Might end up causing more issues later anyways.
But like kind of related to that, if, like let's get plants to suck up more carbon. One thought was to fertilize the ocean with some iron, because phytoplankton are often iron limited in the ocean. Like let's spike it with iron, and then maybe they'll suck up some CO2 out of the atmosphere. There's a lot of ocean out there, so people have been thinking about that stuff.
But there's also, what's the consequence of that?
Exactly.
I got you.
Exactly.
They're wanting to, I remember there was this one thing where they were wanting to crossbreed with the American chestnut because it took up so much CO2 on its own.
Yeah, chestnuts were big trees that were a huge part of the Appalachian forests in the south, and they all got killed by the chestnut blight, and so they're trying to, they've got some breeding with some Chinese species that are resistant to the blight, trying to bring back chestnut, but yeah.
I believe it was American chestnut they were talking about, but yeah, it was apparently, they were just able to suck in so much CO2.
Yeah, I never thought about that, but yeah, like 4 billion chestnut trees died in the late short amount of time. It's bad. Alright, other wetland things, so wetland animals can get messed up, if the hydrologic patterns change, so precipitation patterns are changing, that can mess up their life cycle. And there's also the potential for more fires if you end up with drier conditions. Alright, oh my gosh, slides keep coming. Alright, what's interesting here? So, algae, algae have more of an issue with nutrient enrichment, but adding warming with nutrients, it's kind of a double whammy. And so cyanobacteria, like I mentioned, they also like warmer temperatures, they like extra nutrients. And so if it's warmer, it's gonna be easier for them to outcompete the good algae, the green algae and the diatoms. And so there's more cyanobacteria, we can end up with more harmful algal blooms, and so this is a risk to our water supply. You already hear about stuff on the news like cities on the Great Lakes that use their Great Lakes for tap water. There's a toxic algal bloom, it's really hard to remove the toxin, and then you don't have water. And so we can end up with water scarcity like we have food scarcity in certain areas. And then also harmful algal blooms are going to affect the food webs where they're happening, because now you don't have the good algae, and then the things that eat the good algae, and then the things that eat things that eat things that eat the good algae. What is this? So biodiversity. So we may get more in numbers of invasive species that have pretty wide thermal tolerances. So one reason that species become invasive is that they're pretty tolerant to a lot of conditions, so they can just kind of proliferate wherever they go. And so there's a good chance that a lot of these invasive species will be able to handle temperature change with climate change. Cold intolerant species will start to spread to higher latitudes and altitudes. So this is even native species, but you'll start to see things that couldn't survive up north or up in the mountains, they'll be able to move north and potentially alter those ecosystems. And species that aren't as mobile, so either animals that don't move around a lot or plants that don't have very good dispersal capabilities, they're not going to adapt very well to, like, let's everyone move north. Well, some species just don't move very well.
Like salamander.
More sensitive species will also have more trouble with climate change. Some other stuff. So there may be thermal refugia, where some of these cold tolerant species can still survive. So for example, in a mountainous area, you know, if these animals or these species do well at 8,000 feet and it's gotten warmer, maybe they can just go to 10,000 feet and they'll be fine. Unless you run on a mountain, because the top of it's already gotten too warm. Or watersheds that run north-south. You might get organisms that can go up and down that river, but we do have a lot of rivers that go east-west, and so that may not work very well. So not all rivers or streams or lakes are going to be able to take advantage of that. And warming and pollutants, who knows what's going to happen? That combination. Kind of unknown. And one last thing here, and then I've got a couple maybe bright points, I don't know. Salinity may also increase in areas that have more drought. You get more water evaporating, anything salty gets left behind, so you may see increases in salinity, which would also be no bueno. So, bunch of possible effects. What are we doing about it? So there have been, last year or two, reports got released that are kind of big reports. This one from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They release a report every few years, and it's a whole team of like at least like 50 scientists or something. It's a huge number of people from around the world, and they look at the latest research and basically kind of summarize everything we know about climate change. And then we also have a national climate assessment that sort of looks at what's going on in the US, and they just released a report last November. And so it's about what we know about climate change impacts in the US. There's a web page, you can look at the whole report for both of those reports online. Try to figure out what we know, what we don't know, and for the international one, they give some recommendations. For the National Climate Assessment, it's more like information, like this is what we know about what's happening, but there's no like directives that we should do this or we should do that. It's just sort of like, here's what's happening in various parts of the country. And so, and there's some like take-home messages there as well. Yeah, so the international panel, like they'll make statements like global warming is caused by greenhouse gases that like we know that it's unequivocal. There's no doubt in our minds that greenhouse gases that we release is causing global warming. But they also say things like it's not too late to make positive changes. So there is still hope for the future if we can get more people to realize that there is hope for the future.